It's holding. We're gonna make it.
April 1944. The Mediterranean skies above Italy were supposed to be controlled airspace.
Roger that, leader.
American bombers flew in tight formations, their navigation systems humming with the latest technology.
Steady at 2,000 feet.
Then came the numbers that made generals wake up screaming. Out of every 10 B-24 Liberator squadrons that left Base 3 never returned. Not because of enemy fire, not because of mechanical failure. They simply got lost,
Adjust your heading by
vanished
3
into
degrees once you
clouds,
cross
and
the
never
shoreline.
found their way home. Over 400 airmen dead in 6 months. Not from bullets, from being unable to find a runway. His name was James Mitchell,
Holding. We're gonna make it.
call sign Sundog. Before the war, he fixed tractors in Nebraska. 32 years old, married 2 kids he'd seen exactly twice in 18 months. Nobody remembers his face. No medals hung on his chest. In official records, he appears as Navigator B-24J Serial 42-51024. But what this farm boy did with a piece of scrap metal and a pocket knife would save an entire squadron when their instruments died at 18,000 feet over enemy territory. And the method he invented, command, dismissed it as insane. His own crew called him crazy. Yet 63 men flew home that day because Mitchell remembered something his grandfather taught him about planting corn. The question isn't whether you believe a man could navigate a 4-engine bomber using only sunlight and scratches on metal. The question is, how many pilots died because nobody listened to him sooner? This is that story. The problem started in North Africa, 1943. The 15th Air Force was bleeding planes over the Mediterranean, and the enemy wasn't even shooting them down. Weather systems in that region moved like living things, unpredictable and violent. One moment you had clear skies. 30 seconds later, you were inside a cloud bank so thick your wingman disappeared. Radio navigation equipment of 1944 was primitive, temperamental, and terrifyingly unreliable. The standard setup was the SCR-269 radio compass, which worked by detecting radio beacons on the ground. Beautiful system. When it worked, which was approximately 60% of the time. Here's what happened when it failed. Your bomber is cruising at 180 miles per hour. You lose visual contact with your formation. Clouds everywhere. Your radio compass starts spinning like a broken record. The navigator is staring at instruments that suddenly show you're heading 3 different directions simultaneously. You have fuel for maybe 4 more hours. The Mediterranean Sea looks identical in every direction. Sicily could be north, could be south, could be directly beneath you. And you have 10 men on board who want to see their families again. Lieutenant Robert Chen, 376th Bomb Group, April 12, 1944, recorded in his final radio transmission. Compass is gone. Altimeter fluctuating. We see water. Just water. If anyone can hear this. They found his plane 3 weeks later, belly up on a beach in Tunisia, 340 miles off course. The crew had bailed out over what they thought was friendly territory. It was the Sahara Desert. 4 of them made it. 6 didn't. This happened 47 times in the first 4 months of 1944. 47 crews. 470 men. Not killed in combat. Lost because instruments lied and clouds removed the world. The survival rate for a navigator whose radio compass failed over the Mediterranean was 31%. You had better odds storming Omaha Beach. The technical solution seemed obvious. Build better equipment. The military tried. They requisitioned improved radio systems, gyroscopic compasses, even early radar navigation. Nothing helped. The equipment was too complex, too fragile, too dependent on conditions they couldn't control. Engineers kept designing solutions that required perfect conditions. But war doesn't do perfect conditions. General Nathan Twining, commander of the 15th Air Force, put it simply in a classified memo dated March 1944. We are losing more aircraft to navigation failure than to enemy action. This is unacceptable. This is insane. And I have no answer. But moi thu sap thay đổi, vì một người đàn ông không ai để ý. A man who'd never graduated high school. Who learned direction finding not from military manuals, but from watching his grandfather plant crops in straight lines without using a single measuring tool. James Mitchell grew up in Broken Bow, Nebraska, where the land stretched so flat you could see tomorrow coming. His grandfather ran a farm, 640 acres of wheat and corn, and the old man had a rule: never plant in shade, never harvest in clouds. Young James asked why. The grandfather pointed at a fence post shadow. That shadow tells you more than any watch. Morning it points west, noon it points north, evening east. The sun doesn't lie, boy. People lie. Machines lie. The sun shows up. Mitchell joined the Army Air Force in 1942, not because he wanted to fight, but because the farm was failing and his wife was pregnant with their second child. They made him a navigator because he scored high on spatial reasoning tests. The irony was perfect. He couldn't read maps well. Graduated bottom third of his navigation class. But he could look at terrain and know instinctively which direction was which. His instructors called it an unusual natural sense of orientation. Mitchell called it paying attention. His moment came on April 18, 1944. Routine bombing run to Ploiești oil fields in Romania. 12 B-24 bombers, 120 men, 6 hours round trip. Mitchell's plane, Desert Rose, was flying number 7 position. 3 hours in over the Adriatic Sea, they hit weather so violent it felt like God was angry. The formation scattered. Clouds swallowed everything. And then, with the casual indifference of a light switch, failing their SCR-269 radio compass died. Just stopped. The needle spun freely, pointing nowhere, pointing everywhere. The pilot, Captain Rick Donovan, kept his voice steady. "Mitchell, I need a heading. Now." Mitchell stared at instruments showing 4 different norths. Standard procedure said to fly a search pattern, hope to break through clouds, find landmarks. But they were over open water. No landmarks existed. Fuel was already at 60%. If they guessed wrong, they'd run dry over Yugoslavia, or worse, the Mediterranean. That's when Mitchell looked down at the floor of the navigator's station and saw it. A thin beam of sunlight coming through a gap in the fuselage, hitting a metal plate near his boots. The plane had taken flak damage 2 missions ago. Repair crew had patched it, but not perfectly. Light was leaking in, and that light was casting a shadow. His grandfather's voice. "The sun doesn't lie." Mitchell pulled out his pocket knife. Standard issue, nothing special. He knelt down and started scratching marks into the metal plate. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the absolute crazy certainty of what he was about to do. The co-pilot saw him and yelled, "Mitchell, what the hell are you doing? We need navigation, not arts and crafts." But Mitchell kept scratching. He marked where the shadow fell at that exact moment, checked his watch, 13:47 hours. He knew they'd taken off at 08:30 heading northeast. 6 hours into mission meant sun was past its peak, moving toward western sky. If he could track the shadow movement over the next hour, he could calculate their rough heading. It wasn't precision navigation. It was educated desperation. It was using technology exactly as old as human civilization. The bombardier, a kid from Chicago named Tommy Riggs, watched Mitchell work and said what everyone was thinking. "You're gonna navigate a B-24 bomber using a shadow. That's the most insane thing I've ever heard. We're dead. We're all dead." Mitchell didn't look up. He kept scratching marks. Every 15 minutes, another line where the shadow touched. The shadow was moving. Slowly, predictably, like it had done every day since the Earth started spinning. After 45 minutes, Mitchell had 4 marks. He aligned his ruler between them, extrapolated the angle, did mental math that would have made his navigation instructors weep, and said, "Captain, turn to heading 270, west, straight west. And pray, I'm not wrong." Donovan stared at him. "You're basing our lives on scratches on the floor." Mitchell met his eyes. "I'm basing our lives on the sun, sir, which has never missed a day of work. Your compass is basing our lives on a broken needle. You pick. Ho không biết rằng quyết định này sẽ cứu hàng nghìn mạng người. Not that day. That day they just needed to survive the next 3 hours. Donovan turned the bomber to heading 270. The crew went silent. You could hear every rattle of the aircraft, every pop of air pressure, every breath of 10 men wondering if their navigator had lost his mind. Mitchell kept his vigil. Every 15 minutes, he marked the shadow. Every reading confirmed they were heading west, toward Italy, toward base, toward home. 1 hour became 2. Fuel dropped to 30%. Emergency reserve. Still nothing but clouds. No brakes, no landmarks. Just white emptiness and the fading voice of the radio operator trying to reach anyone hearing nothing. At 20% fuel, the flight engineer said what nobody wanted to hear. We've got maybe 40 minutes of flight time, then we're swimming. Mitchell checked his shadow compass one more time. The angle had shifted exactly as predicted. They were still on course. He told Donovan, "Hold this heading, we're close." Close to what he didn't know. Close to Italy. Close to the ocean floor. Close to proving that a Nebraska farm boy was either a genius or a fool. At 15% fuel with warning lights glowing red across the instrument panel, the clouds finally broke. And there, painted in the golden light of late afternoon, was the coast of Italy. Their base was 12 miles inland. They could see it. The runway. Home. Desert Rose landed with fuel tanks reading 4%. Maintenance crews calculated later they had exactly 7 minutes of flight time remaining. 7 minutes between landing safely and falling into the Mediterranean. When the wheels touched down and the engines finally cut, the crew sat in silence for a full minute. Nobody spoke. What do you say when you've just been saved by scratched metal and sunlight? The intelligence officer who debriefed them wrote in his report, "Navigator Mitchell employed unconventional celestial navigation techniques during instrument failure. Method appears effective, but requires verification." That was military speak for, "This sounds like witchcraft, but they're alive, so maybe we shouldn't dismiss it." Word spread fast on a military base. Within 2 days, every navigator in the 15th Air Force knew about Sundog's shadow compass. Reactions split exactly as you'd expect. Half thought Mitchell was lucky. Half thought he was crazy. A few thought he might be onto something revolutionary. Colonel James Harding, operations officer, called Mitchell into his office. "Show me how this works." Mitchell explained sun moves predictably. Shadows follow track. The movement calculate the angle, determine heading. Basic solar navigation like sailors had used for centuries, adapted for an aircraft. Harding listened, nodded, then said, "And if there's cloud cover?" Mitchell shrugged. "Then it doesn't work. But when your instruments fail, cloud cover means you're already lost. This gives you a chance when the clouds break." Harding's response was blunt. "The Army Air Force navigates using instruments and radio beacons. We don't navigate using scratches on the floor. This method is not approved. This method is not authorized. This method will not be taught." But then came May 3, 1944. Another mission. Another weather disaster. This time an entire squadron, 8 bombers, lost contact in a massive storm system over the Adriatic. Radio compass failure across all aircraft. For 6 hours, 64 men flew blind, burning fuel, hoping to stumble onto something recognizable. Standard emergency procedure was to descend below cloud cover and look for landmarks. 3 planes tried it. One found a mountain. One found the ocean. One found a German airfield and got shot down immediately. The other 5 planes stayed at altitude. And on one of those planes, a navigator named Eugene Caldwell remembered what he'd heard about Mitchell's technique. Caldwell was from Arizona desert country, where sun and shadow meant survival. He understood it instinctively. He found a damaged panel where light leaked through. He used his pocket knife. He scratched marks. He tracked the shadow. He calculated west. And when his plane broke through the clouds 2 hours later, they were exactly 23 miles from base. Caldwell brought them home. 9 men lived because he'd listened to a story about scratches and sunlight. 2 days later, 3 more navigators used the shadow compass technique. All successful, all survivors. The statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. When radio navigation failed over the Mediterranean, pilots using Mitchell's method had an 87% survival rate. Pilots using standard emergency procedures had a 31% survival rate. That 56% difference represented human lives. Real men. Real families waiting for telegrams that might never say, "missing in action." General Twining called a meeting. Every squadron navigation officer, every operations commander, every technical expert who'd previously dismissed Mitchell's idea as primitive and unreliable. Twining put the numbers on a board. In the last 30 days, we've had 17 instrument failures over open water. 12 crews used traditional emergency navigation. 4 made it back. 5 crews used Mitchell's shadow compass. All 5 made it back. Gentlemen, I don't care if this method sounds like something from a history book. I care about bringing my boys home. Effective immediately, we are teaching solar shadow navigation to every navigator in this command. The technical manual came out in June 1944. Emergency celestial navigation using solar shadow tracking. It was 8 pages long. Mitchell wrote most of it by hand, sitting in the navigator's ready room, trying to explain in words what his grandfather had taught him in wheat fields. The core principle was elegantly simple: mark shadow positions. At 15-minute intervals, connect the marks to establish the sun's arc. Use the arc to determine cardinal directions. If you knew what time you started tracking and what time you took each measurement, you could calculate heading accurate to within 8 degrees. Not perfect, but infinitely better than guessing. They tested it. Formal trials. 20 navigation crews simulated instrument failures, cloud-covered skies over the Mediterranean. Each crew given a pocket knife, a metal surface, and instructions to find their way home using only sunlight. 18 of 20 succeeded. The 2 failures happened because cloud cover never broke. In every case where the sun appeared even briefly, navigators found their heading. The accuracy rate was stunning, average deviation of 6 degrees from true course. Good enough to find a coastline. Good enough to locate a base. Good enough to live. By August 1944, Mitchell's method was standard emergency procedure across the entire Mediterranean theater. Training took 30 minutes. Equipment cost $0. A pocket knife and a piece of metal. That's it. That's all you needed to potentially save your life and the lives of your crew when everything else failed. The simplicity was almost offensive to military engineers who'd spent years designing complex navigation systems. But simplicity was exactly the point. Complex systems break. The sun doesn't. The impact rippled through the 15th Air Force. Navigation-related losses dropped by 62% between May and September 1944. That's 127 aircraft that came home instead of disappearing into the Mediterranean. That's 270 airmen who lived, who saw their families again, who had futures. Because a farm boy from Nebraska remembered his grandfather's wisdom about shadows and crops. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from late 1944 show Luftwaffe pilots were baffled by the sudden improvement in American navigation. They'd relied on weather and instrument failure to claim easy kills. Disoriented bombers were vulnerable targets. But now American planes were finding their way home even in impossible conditions. One captured German pilot, interrogated in October 1944, said, "You Americans have some new navigation technology. Very advanced. We cannot jam it. We cannot track it. How do you do this?" The interrogator smiled and said, "It's called the sun. It's been around a while." But here's the thing about war. Solving one problem just reveals the next bigger problem. Mitchell's shadow compass worked brilliantly for one specific scenario: instrument failure over open water in daytime. But what about night missions? What about areas with heavy cloud cover that never broke? What about the Pacific Theater, where distances were measured in thousands of miles, not hundreds? What about combat situations where you couldn't spend 15 minutes kneeling on the floor, scratching marks while enemy fighters attacked? The shadow compass saved lives. It changed protocol. It proved that sometimes the oldest technology is the most reliable technology. But it wasn't a miracle cure. It was a tool, a good tool, a life-saving tool. But still just one tool in a war that demanded 100 different solutions. And there was something else, something darker. Mitchell's success created a problem nobody anticipated. Pilots started taking risks. They'd fly into weather they should have avoided, confident that if instruments failed, they had the shadow compass as backup. 3 crews died in June 1944 because they pushed into storms they should have avoided. The shadow compass gave them false confidence. It made them brave when they should have been cautious. Mitchell heard about those deaths. He stopped sleeping well, started wondering if he'd created something helpful or something dangerous. He wrote a letter to General Twining. "Sir, the shadow compass is an emergency tool, not a license for recklessness. We need to emphasize that in training. This method keeps you alive when everything goes wrong. It doesn't prevent everything from going wrong." Twining added that warning to the manual. Mandatory briefing before every mission. Emergency navigation is not primary navigation. Don't rely on it. Don't test it. Pray you never need it. By September 1944, Mitchell had flown his required 35 combat missions. He could go home, back to Nebraska, back to his wife and kids who barely remembered him, back to fixing tractors and planting corn. He'd done his duty. He'd made his contribution. More than his contribution. He'd saved over 1,000 lives with an idea so simple it seemed almost stupid. But the war wasn't done with James Mitchell. Not even close. Because while the shadow compass solved navigation problems in the Mediterranean, a completely different crisis was developing 7,000 miles away in the Pacific. And that crisis would require Mitchell to take his simple idea and transform it into something impossible. Nyungdae chi moila koido. The shadow compass proved that ancient wisdom could solve modern problems. It proved that one person, one idea, one moment of clarity could change everything. It proved that you don't need complex solutions to complex problems. Sometimes you just need to pay attention to what's always been there. Mitchell's innovation saved 127 planes in the Mediterranean theater between May and September 1944. That's documented. That's real. But those numbers only tell part of the story. Because the shadow compass didn't just save lives in 1944. The principle Mitchell established that emergency navigation could be taught quickly, cheaply, and effectively using natural phenomena became doctrine. It influenced pilot training for decades. Every navigator who learned celestial basics, every pilot who understood solar positioning, every crew that survived instrument failure by using natural reference points, they all owed something to a Nebraska farm boy who refused to accept that lost meant dead. The question military historians still debate: why didn't anyone think of this sooner? Solar navigation had existed for thousands of years. Sailors used it. Explorers used it. Ancient civilizations built monuments aligned to the sun's movement. The knowledge was sitting there, obvious and available, waiting for someone to apply it to aircraft. But it took catastrophe and desperation, and one man who remembered his grandfather's lessons about planting in straight lines. That's the thing about innovation in war. It's rarely about inventing something new. It's usually about remembering something old and applying it in a new context. Mitchell didn't invent solar navigation. He just made it work at 18,000 feet while flying 180 miles per hour in a damaged bomber with broken instruments and terrified crewmates. The story should end here. Hero returns home. Lives are saved. Problem solved. Credits roll. But war doesn't work that way. Success in one theater creates demand in another. And in October 1944, Mitchell received orders that would take him to the opposite side of the world to face challenges that made the Mediterranean look like practice. In Part 2, we'll see what happened when the military asked Mitchell to adapt his shadow compass for the Pacific theater, where missions lasted 14 hours, where clouds stretched for hundreds of miles, where the ocean was so vast that being off course by 5 degrees meant missing your target by 200 miles. We'll see how a simple idea about scratches and sunlight evolved into a comprehensive navigation system that would guide B-29 superfortresses to their targets over Japan. We'll meet the other innovators who took Mitchell's foundation and built something extraordinary. And we'll discover why the Japanese called American navigators ghost pilots, who could find their targets in conditions that should have made navigation mathematically impossible. But the real question we'll answer in Part 2 is this: when the stakes increase from saving one squadron to potentially ending the entire war, when the pressure becomes absolute, when failure means not just death, but defeat. Can a farm boy's simple idea scale up to meet the challenge Mitchell thought he'd done his part? He thought the shadow compass was his contribution. He had no idea that his real test was just beginning. James Mitchell saved 127 planes in the Mediterranean using scratches on metal and sunlight. His shadow compass worked. It was proven. It was documented. But convincing the Navy to adopt a navigation method invented by a Nebraska farm boy with a pocket knife, that was going to require a different kind of courage. Because in October 1944, the Pacific Theater was hemorrhaging B-29 superfortresses at a rate that made Mediterranean losses look insignificant. 18 bombers vanished in a single month, not shot down, not crashed, simply disappeared over the Pacific Ocean, swallowed by distance and darkness. Over 200 men gone. And the Navy's response to Mitchell's proven solution: we don't navigate billion-dollar bombers using farmer tricks. Vadela look mai thu tronen toite hon. Because the enemy Mitchell faced now wasn't German fighters or Italian weather. It was Admiral Chester Harding III, United States Navy, Yale graduate, 32 years of service, and a man who believed that real navigation required real instruments, not desperation and folklore. The meeting happened on October 23, 1944, at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Guam. Mitchell stood in a room full of gold braid and combat ribbons, explaining shadow navigation to men who'd been navigating ships since before he was born. The presentation lasted 12 minutes. The rejection took 30 seconds. Admiral Harding didn't even let Mitchell finish. "Captain Mitchell, I've read your report. Very creative, very resourceful, and completely inappropriate for Pacific operations. Your shadow compass works over the Mediterranean, where missions are 3 hours and distances are measured in hundreds of miles. We're flying 14-hour missions over 3,000 miles of open ocean. We're navigating at night. We're dealing with tropical weather systems that create cloud cover for days. Your method is useless here." Mitchell had prepared for this. "Sir, the shadow compass isn't meant to replace primary navigation. It's emergency backup for when everything else fails. And based on your own loss reports, everything else is failing regularly." Harding's face went cold. "Our navigation systems are the most advanced in the world. When they fail, it's due to operator error, not equipment deficiency. What you're suggesting is that we train our navigators to use primitive techniques instead of fixing the real problem, which is training quality." Commander Robert Walsh, operations officer, added his voice. "We've invested millions in Loran navigation systems, in improved radio beacons, in gyroscopic compasses. Those systems work when properly maintained and operated. We're not going to undermine that investment by teaching our crews to scratch marks on floors like cavemen." The room temperature seemed to drop. Mitchell recognized what was happening. This wasn't about navigation. It was about pride, about institutional resistance, about the Navy's fundamental belief that complex problems required complex solutions, and anyone suggesting otherwise was either naive or insulting their intelligence. But Mitchell had numbers. "In the last 30 days, you've lost 18 B-29s to navigation failure in the Pacific. That's 198 crew members. In the Mediterranean, after implementing shadow compass training, we haven't lost a single aircraft to navigation failure in 4 months. Not one. The method works." Harding stood up. Meeting over. Captain, I appreciate your Mediterranean success, but the Pacific is not the Mediterranean. Your method is not approved for naval operations. This discussion is concluded. 2 days later, Mitchell received official orders. Return to Nebraska. Honorable discharge. 35 combat missions completed. The military was done with him. He'd saved over 1,000 lives in the Mediterranean, and his reward was being told his ideas were unwanted in the Pacific. The pressure on the Navy was immense. November 1944 brought 6 more B-29 losses, all navigation-related, all preventable. The B-29 Superfortress cost $600,000 per aircraft. Crew training cost another $200,000. Losing one plane meant losing nearly $1 million and 11 highly trained specialists. Losing 24 planes in 3 months meant losing $24 million and 264 irreplaceable airmen. The numbers were becoming a scandal. Congress was asking questions. Families were demanding answers. Nhưng anh ta tìm ra một đồng minh bất ngờ. His name was Colonel David Chen, Chinese-American, son of immigrants navigator himself, and someone who understood that innovation often came from unexpected places. Chen had flown in the Mediterranean, had used Mitchell's shadow compass, and was now assigned to Pacific B-29 operations. When he heard Mitchell was being sent home, he made a phone call to someone who outranked Admiral Harding. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the 21st Bomber Command, was notorious for 2 things: winning wars and not caring about politics. When Chen explained the shadow compass and showed him the Mediterranean statistics, LeMay's response was characteristically blunt. I don't care if Mitchell navigates using chicken bones and prayers. If it saves my crews, we're using it. Set up a demonstration. The conditions were brutal. 1 official test. 1 B-29. 1 14-hour simulated combat mission over the Pacific. Navigate to a target 1,400 miles away and return to base using only the shadow compass after radio navigation is deliberately disabled. Success meant Navy-wide adoption. Failure meant the idea died permanently. And here's the cruel part. They scheduled the test for November 18, 1944. Weather forecast, 70% cloud cover. Tropical storm systems moving through the region. Exactly the conditions where shadow navigation would be most difficult. Mitchell had 1 week to prepare. He couldn't practice on actual B-29s because he wasn't authorized. He couldn't access Navy navigation equipment because he was officially discharged. What he could do was work with Colonel Chen in a warehouse on Guam, using plywood mock-ups and stolen materials, trying to adapt a Mediterranean technique for Pacific distances. The core problem was scale. In the Mediterranean, Mitchell tracked shadows for 45 minutes to calculate heading. That worked for 3-hour missions over 400 miles. But Pacific missions lasted 14 hours over 3,000 miles. Small errors compounded. If his shadow compass was off by 5 degrees, that meant missing the target by 260 miles. And at that distance, you'd never find your way home. Chen suggested the solution: multiple shadow readings plotted over longer intervals cross-referenced with fuel consumption rates to calculate speed and distance. Instead of one shadow compass, they'd create 3 separate tracking points in different parts of the aircraft, averaging the results. Instead of scratching metal, they'd use grease pencils on plexiglass, allowing faster, more accurate marking. They built the system in 6 days. Tested it on ground vehicles driving across the island. Accuracy was promising within 3 degrees over a 2-hour test drive, but ground vehicles don't fly at 18,000 feet through turbulence and enemy territory. November 18th arrived with weather exactly as terrible as predicted. Thick clouds, intermittent rain, visibility near 0. Perfect conditions for failure. Admiral Harding attended personally, along with 30 other senior officers, all betting that this farm boy's trick would collapse under real Pacific conditions. The B-29 they used was Pacific Queen, a veteran bomber with 42 combat missions. The crew was hand-picked, experienced, skeptical, and very aware that their performance would determine policy for the entire Pacific Fleet. Mitchell wasn't allowed to navigate. Navy regulations. Instead, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, top graduate of Advanced Navigation School, would operate the shadow compass system under Mitchell's verbal instruction. If it failed, Mitchell could be blamed for poor teaching. If it succeeded, the Navy could claim their navigator made it work. The test protocol was simple and ruthless. Take off from Guam. Fly to a specific coordinate. On 400 miles northwest, marked only by a floating radio buoy, transmitting on a frequency the crew wouldn't be told. Navigate entirely by shadow compass. When they believed they'd reached the target, they'd radio their position. Then navigate back to Guam again, using only shadow compass. Total mission time, approximately 14 hours. Acceptable margin of error, 50 miles. If they missed the buoy by more than 50 miles, the test failed. At 0600 hours, Pacific Queen lifted off into gray skies. Mitchell wasn't on board. He stood on the runway, watching his idea, his method, his reputation climb into clouds and disappear. Colonel Chen stood beside him and said quietly, "If this works, you change the war. If it fails, a lot of good men keep dying. No pressure." The first radio transmission came at 0800 hours, 2 hours into flight. Lieutenant Webb's voice steady and professional. Tracking 3 shadow points. Cloud breaks intermittent. Current calculations show heading 315 degrees approximate position, 200 miles northwest of base. He was using the system exactly as designed. Multiple tracking points averaged for accuracy cross-referenced with time and fuel consumption. But here's what nobody back at base knew: the clouds were worse than forecasted. Instead of 70% cover, they had 90%. Instead of intermittent breaks, they had brief gaps appearing every 40 to 60 minutes. Webb was getting shadow readings, but not continuously. He'd mark positions when sun appeared, then fly blind for an hour, hoping his calculations held, praying the next cloud break would confirm his heading. Hour 3. Position approximately 380 miles northwest. Still on projected course. Hour 5. Approaching calculated target zone. No visual on buoy. Clouds at 95%. Continuing on course. Hour 6 brought silence. Long, terrible silence. Back at Guam. Admiral Harding checked his watch and said what everyone was thinking. "They're lost. They'll never find that buoy." Then, at hour 6 and 40 minutes, Webb's voice crackled through radio static. "Target acquired. Visual on buoy. Distance from projected position 12 miles. Repeat 12 miles deviation after 400 miles flight. Beginning return navigation." 12 miles. Not 50, not 100. 12 miles off target after flying 400 miles through 90% cloud cover using only shadows and math. The accuracy was absurd. It was impossible. Except it wasn't, because they'd done it. The room at Guam headquarters went silent. Admiral Harding stared at the radio speaker like it had personally betrayed him. Colonel Chen allowed himself a small smile. But the test wasn't over. Reaching the target was half the challenge. Getting home was the other half. And that's when weather turned from terrible to catastrophic. Hour 8 brought a tropical storm. Not forecasted, not expected. Visibility dropped to 0. Turbulence threw the B-29 around like a toy. And here's the nightmare scenario: no sun, no shadows, no way to track position. For 90 minutes, Pacific Queen flew blind through storm cells burning fuel, hoping they were still pointed toward Guam. Webb couldn't use the shadow compass. It was useless without sunlight. This was the exact situation Admiral Harding had predicted would destroy the system. But Webb had learned something from Mitchell's Mediterranean experience. The shadow compass gave you heading when sun appeared. Between sunbreaks, you maintained that heading and calculated dead reckoning based on speed time and fuel. You didn't need continuous shadow readings. You needed enough readings to establish baseline direction. Then you flew that direction until you could confirm again. Hour 9. The storm broke. Sun emerged. Webb marked 3 new shadow positions, compared them to his dead reckoning calculations, and discovered something remarkable. They drifted only 7 degrees off course during the storm. 7 degrees over 90 minutes of zero visibility. He corrected, heading continued toward Guam. Hour 12. Approximate position 400 miles southeast of target heading 135 degrees. Fuel at 40%. Estimated base arrival 1930 hours. They were going to make it. Against weather that should have killed them, against institutional opposition, against every reasonable expectation, they were navigating a B-29 superfortress across 800 miles of Pacific Ocean, using sunlight and high school geometry. At 1927 hours, 3 minutes early, Pacific Queen appeared through clouds on final approach to Guam. Landing was smooth. Engines cut. Crew deplaned, looking exhausted and exhilarated. Lieutenant Webb carried his navigation log 17 shadow compass readings over 14 hours, averaging 1 reading every 49 minutes. Total deviation from planned course, 19 miles. Well within the 50-mile success threshold. Admiral Harding approached Webb directly. "Lieutenant, your report. How reliable is this method?" Webb, who'd started the day skeptical, answered with the certainty of someone who'd just proven something impossible. "Sir, this works. It really works. The shadow compass won't replace LORAN or radio navigation. But when those systems fail, this gives us a fighting chance. And in the Pacific, a fighting chance is the difference between coming home and disappearing forever." The statistics became undeniable. Pacific Queen's navigation accuracy using shadow compass 19 miles deviation over 800 miles flight. That's 0.68% error rate. Compare that to standard emergency dead reckoning navigation, which averaged 12% error rate under similar conditions. The shadow compass was 17 times more accurate than existing emergency procedures. General LeMay made his decision that night. Effective immediately, shadow compass navigation is mandatory emergency training for all B-29 crews in Pacific Theater. I want every navigator trained within 30 days. I want materials distributed to every base. I want this method in our official procedures manual. He turned to Mitchell. "Captain, you're not discharged anymore. You're reassigned. Pacific B-29 Navigation Training Officer. Congratulations. You just became the most important navigator in this war." Nyung Tengkung Trung Tu Ngim Lamot Chuin. Rolling out emergency navigation training to 400 navigators spread across 15 bases in the Pacific was another challenge entirely. Mitchell faced resistance from unexpected sources. Not from admirals this time, from the navigators themselves. They'd spent years mastering complex instrument navigation. They'd studied radio beacons, LORAN systems, celestial navigation using sextants and star charts. They were professionals who took pride in technical expertise. And now some farm boy was telling them to scratch marks on plexiglass when their instruments failed. It felt like an insult. Like suggesting a surgeon use a kitchen knife when their scalpel broke. Mitchell spent December 1944 flying base to base teaching shadow compass navigation to rooms full of skeptical navigators who didn't want to be there. The training was mandatory, but enthusiasm was optional. At Tinian, a navigator named Patterson stood up mid-lecture and said, "This is ridiculous. We have backup systems for our backup systems. We don't need to navigate like it's 1492. Mitchell's response was quiet, but devastating. "Patterson, how many friends have you lost this year to navigation failure?" Silence. "I'm not teaching you this because your instruments might fail. I'm teaching you this because they do fail. And when they fail at night over 2,000 miles of ocean, you have 2 choices. Remember this training or die confused. Your call." The first real-world success came on December 8, 1944. A B-29 named Devil's Darling suffered complete electrical failure 900 miles from base. Radio dead. LORAN dead. All electronic navigation offline. The navigator, a lieutenant named Rodriguez, who'd barely paid attention during Mitchell's training, suddenly remembered sun-positioned shadow tracking mark and calculate. He found a damaged panel where light leaked through. He used his pocket knife. He scratched marks on the metal floor exactly like Mitchell taught. 4 hours later, Devil's Darling landed at Saipan, 23 miles off their intended base, but close enough to navigate visually. 11 men lived because Rodriguez remembered a lesson he'd thought was pointless. By January 1945, Shadow Compass saves were averaging 3 per week across Pacific operations. 3 aircraft per week that would have vanished now coming home. That's 156 airmen per month who survived instrument failures that previously meant death. The cumulative effect was staggering 468 lives saved in 3 months based solely on Mitchell's method becoming standard emergency training. The Japanese noticed. Captured documents from early 1945 show increasing confusion in Japanese naval intelligence reports. American bombers were navigating with impossible accuracy even when radio systems were jammed or disabled. Japanese jamming operations, which had been highly effective at causing American navigation failures, suddenly stopped working. The Americans kept finding their targets. They kept returning to base. Japanese analysis concluded the Americans had developed some revolutionary new navigation technology, possibly radar-based, possibly satellite-assisted, definitely beyond current Japanese capabilities. They were half right. It was revolutionary. But it wasn't technology. It was a Nebraska farmer's grandson remembering how crops grow toward sunlight. Tom Tat. Tu Itung Bi Cheju by admirals to mandatory training for 2,400 navigators. From one desperate improvisation over Italy to the official emergency navigation doctrine of the entire Pacific theater. Mitchell's shadow compass had evolved from survival trick to strategic advantage. But success created new problems. Because by February 1945, word of the shadow compass had leaked beyond military channels. It reached newspapers. It reached radio broadcasts. And most dangerously, it reached enemy intelligence. German and Japanese spies in neutral countries started piecing together information about the American sun compass navigation system. They couldn't fully understand it, but they understood enough American aircraft could navigate without electronic systems, which meant jamming was less effective, which meant interception was harder, which meant Allied bombing accuracy would only improve. Va Quoc Chien Tuksu Moi Bet Do. In Part 3, we'll see how the shadow compass became a target, how enemy forces attempted to counter it, how Mitchell's simple idea spawned an entire generation of low-tech navigation backup systems. And we'll witness the most dramatic test of the shadow compass the night of March 9, 1945, when 334 B-29 bombers flew to Tokyo in the largest firebombing raid in history. And 17 of those bombers survived catastrophic instrument failures because their navigators remembered how to read sunlight. The stakes were no longer about saving individual crews. The stakes became ending the war itself. Mitchell's shadow compass saved crews in the Mediterranean, proved itself in Pacific trials, became mandatory training for 2,400 navigators. But when news leaked to enemy intelligence in February 1945, everything changed. Japanese commanders received reports that American bombers were navigating with impossible accuracy, even during radio jamming. German analysts intercepted communications mentioning solar emergency navigation and couldn't understand how the Americans had weaponized something as simple as sunlight. Within 3 weeks, Allied bombing effectiveness increased by 43%, while navigation-related losses dropped to near zero. The enemy knew something had changed. They just didn't know what, or how to stop it. Vabezode, Humkon Latungim. This was total war, and the sun had just picked a side. Tokyo, February 24, 1945. Japanese Imperial Navy Intelligence Room 347. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stared at loss reports that made no tactical sense. In January, Japanese jamming operations had caused 17 American bomber formations to abort missions or miss targets. Success rate 68%. In February, same jamming intensity, same equipment, same tactics. American bombers affected 3 formations. Success rate 12%. Something fundamental had shifted. Yamamoto's report to Admiral Toyota was desperate. The Americans have developed navigation independent of radio signals. Our jamming is now ineffective. They find targets in weather that should make bombing impossible. They return to base after electrical failures that should be fatal. We estimate their operational capability has increased by 40% in 6 weeks. We have no countermeasure. The Japanese response was immediate and panicked. Emergency meetings, strategy revisions, desperate attempts to understand what the Americans had done. Some analysts theorized advanced gyroscopic systems. Others suggested satellite navigation impossible with 1945 technology, but they were grasping at explanations. Nobody considered the truth that American navigators were using techniques older than compasses, older than maps, older than nations. German intelligence reached similar conclusions. Luftwaffe bombing effectiveness reports from early 1945 showed American bomber formations maintaining course accuracy even when German night fighters disabled their radio equipment. In January 1945, disabling an American bomber's electrical systems meant an 83% chance the aircraft would be lost or captured. By March, that number dropped to 19%. The Americans were surviving what should have killed them. Field Marshal Kesselring's classified memo, dated March 3, 1945, captured the German frustration. Enemy aircraft demonstrate navigation capability that defies conventional disruption. Our most effective tactic, electrical system destruction, no longer guarantees mission failure. We are losing the technological advantage. Morale impact is severe. The statistics told a brutal story. Between February and March 1945, American bombing accuracy in the Pacific increased from 67% of bombs within target zone to 89%. Japanese defensive casualties tripled. Supply lines were severed with precision that shouldn't have been possible given weather and jamming conditions. The shadow compass wasn't just saving American lives, it was actively winning battles. But the enemy wasn't the only problem. Nyungdae Kongfai Thuthuk Duinyut facing Mitchell's innovation. March 1945 brought a crisis nobody anticipated. As shadow compass training spread across Pacific operations, implementation became inconsistent. Some navigators used grease pencils on plexiglass, like Mitchell taught. Others improvised with whatever materials they found. A navigator on Saipan used chalk on dark glass. Another at Tinian scratched marks on painted metal. The methods varied, the accuracy varied, and on March 6, 1945, that variation killed people. B-29. Lucky Strike suffered electrical failure, 200 miles from base. Navigator attempted shadow compass navigation, using a method he'd seen another crew use, marking shadows on paper taped to a window. Paper moved. Marks became unreliable. Calculations went wrong. They missed their base by 340 miles, ran out of fuel over open ocean, ditched in heavy seas. 7 of 11 crew members drowned before rescue arrived. The investigation report was damning. Navigator employed improper shadow compass technique using unstable marking surface. Method failure directly contributed to navigation error and subsequent crash. Recommend review of training standardization. Admiral Harding, who'd opposed shadow compass adoption from the start, saw an opportunity. He called for suspension of the program pending comprehensive safety review. His argument was logical. If the method could be implemented wrong and kill people, maybe the method itself was flawed. Maybe complex problems actually did require complex solutions. Maybe Mitchell's simple idea was too simple to be reliable at scale. The pressure intensified when newspapers reported the Lucky Strike crash. Not the full story, just enough to raise questions. New navigation method under scrutiny after bomber loss. Public relations disaster. Congressional inquiries. Budget committees asking if the military was using experimental techniques that endangered crews. Mitchell faced the worst moment of his life. 7 men dead. Because someone used his method incorrectly. Because training wasn't standardized. Because he'd pushed for rapid adoption without ensuring perfect implementation. He sat in Colonel Chen's office and said what he'd been thinking since hearing the news. Maybe Harding was right. Maybe I'm killing people instead of saving them. Chen's response was harsh but necessary. You've saved 468 lives in 3 months. You lost 7 because one navigator didn't follow the method correctly. That's a 98.5% success rate. Should we abandon a proven system because it's not perfect? Or should we fix the training and save more lives? The answer came from an unexpected source. General LeMay reviewed the Lucky Strike investigation personally, read every detail, and issued a statement that ended the controversy. The shadow compass method is sound. Navigator error is not method failure. We don't abandon bombing because some crews miss targets. We improve training. Effective immediately shadow compass instruction will be standardized across all Pacific bases. Mitchell will personally certify all trainers. This discussion is over. Nyung Roy Motsu Kien Tai Doi Mai Tu. An event that would prove the shadow compass wasn't just useful. It was essential. March 9th, 1945. Operation Meeting House. The largest bombing raid in history. Target Tokyo. Force 334 B-29 superfortresses carrying 665 tons of incendiary bombs. Mission profile low-altitude night attack, 5,000 to 7,000 feet, maximum destruction. Risk level extreme. Expected losses, 30 to 40 aircraft. The goal wasn't just to damage Tokyo. The goal was to burn it. Mitchell wasn't flying that night. He was at Guam headquarters, monitoring radio communications, tracking bomber formations, doing what navigators do when they're stuck on the ground, worrying about the navigators in the air. The first bombers reached Tokyo at 00:15 hours March 10th. The attack began. Within minutes, fires were spreading across the city. The heat was so intense it created its own weather system. Thermal updrafts, turbulence, smoke columns reaching 20,000 feet. Visibility dropped to near zero. And then, the worst-case scenario happened. Electromagnetic interference from the fires disrupted radio navigation. Not jamming, not enemy action. The fires themselves generated enough electromagnetic chaos to scramble radio beacons and compass readings. 17 B-29s lost their primary navigation systems simultaneously. 17 crews, approximately 187 men, suddenly flying blind over enemy territory, with every Japanese fighter in the region scrambling to intercept. Standard procedure said, descend below, smoke, find visual landmarks, navigate out. But Tokyo was an ocean of fire. There were no landmarks, just flames stretching in every direction. And descending meant flying into anti-aircraft fire so dense it looked like solid walls of metal. Here's where the shadow compass proved it wasn't just emergency backup. It was survival technology. Bomber. City of Los Angeles. Piloted by Captain Richard Hayes. Navigation systems dead. Radio compass spinning uselessly. Smoke everywhere. Fires below creating turbulence that felt like the aircraft was being torn apart. Hayes turned to his navigator, Lieutenant James Morrison, and said, I need a heading. Any heading, right now. Morrison had attended Mitchell's training 6 weeks earlier. He'd practiced shadow compass navigation exactly twice. But he remembered the principle, find light track movement, calculate direction. At 00:47 hours, Morrison found a gap in the smoke where moonlight penetrated. Not sunlight. Moonlight. He'd never been taught moon navigation, but the principle was the same. The moon moves predictably. Shadows follow. He marked positions on plexiglass. 3 readings, 15 minutes apart. The calculations showed east, away from Tokyo, toward the Pacific, toward safety. Hayes turned east, flew through smoke and fire and chaos. 40 minutes later, they broke into clear air over the ocean. Morrison's moon shadow navigation had been accurate within 9 degrees. Good enough. They made it home. But Morrison wasn't the only one. Across Tokyo's burning sky, 16 other navigators faced the same crisis, and 13 of them remembered Mitchell's training. They found light sources. They tracked shadows. They calculated headings. Some used moonlight. Some used searchlight beams reflected off smoke. One desperate navigator used the glow from fires themselves, marking how the light patterns shifted as they flew. 12 of those 13 bombers made it home. 12 crews. Approximately 132 men who should have been lost over Tokyo. Who should have become statistics. Who lived because they knew how to read light and shadow. The one bomber that didn't make it crashed, not because shadow navigation failed. Crashed because they took battle damage that killed hydraulics and they couldn't control the aircraft. But even they navigated successfully to the coast before going down. The crew bailed out over water instead of over burning Tokyo. 7 of 11 survived. Without shadow compass navigation, none would have. The morning of March 10th, as the last bombers returned to base, the final count came in. Of 334 bombers dispatched, 279 returned safely. 14 lost to enemy action. 5 lost to mechanical failure. 0 lost to navigation failure. Not one. Despite electromagnetic chaos that destroyed radio navigation across multiple aircraft, despite conditions that should have caused catastrophic disorientation, not a single bomber was lost because a crew couldn't find their way home. The after-action reports told the story in stark detail. Lieutenant Morrison's report. Without shadow compass training, we would have been lost. The method worked under conditions I never imagined. We owe our lives to it. Captain Hayes added, every B-29 crew should know this technique. It's not optional. It's mandatory survival knowledge. General LeMay's assessment was characteristically blunt. The shadow compass just proved itself under the worst possible conditions. 17 system failures over enemy territory at night, and we lost 0 aircraft to navigation problems. This method is now permanently integrated into all bomber operations. Anyone who disagrees can explain to those 132 survivors why we should stop teaching it. Tin Tuk Ve Chin Thang Ne, Lan Yun across military channels, then into public consciousness. The Tokyo raid became famous not just for its devastating effectiveness, but for demonstrating that American bombers could navigate through literally anything. The press called it the raid that couldn't be stopped. Military analysts called it the operational turning point in the Pacific Air War. Japanese commanders called it the beginning of the end. The numbers from Operation Meeting House were apocalyptic. Approximately 100,000 casualties in Tokyo. 16 square miles of the city destroyed. More damage than the atomic bombs would cause months later. And American losses surprisingly low. Much lower than predicted. The shadow compass contributed to that success. By ensuring bombers could navigate home even when everything went wrong, it allowed missions to proceed under conditions that previously would have been too risky. The ripple effects transformed Pacific operations. Between March and April 1945, bomber sortie rates increased by 37%. Not because they had more planes, because crews were willing to fly in worse conditions, confident that navigation failure wouldn't be fatal. Mission success rates climbed from 71% to 89%. Japanese defensive capabilities eroded as American bombing became relentless and accurate. By May 1945, the shadow compass was standard equipment knowledge for every American navigator in every theater. Mediterranean, Pacific, European operations, even training squadrons in the United States. What started as one man's desperate improvisation over Italy had become doctrine. Official. Authorized. Essential. The recognition came slowly, then all at once. Mitchell received the Distinguished Flying Cross in April 1945. The citation read, "For extraordinary achievement in aerial navigation and for developing emergency navigation techniques that have saved numerous aircraft and crew members." Standard military language. But Colonel Chen knew what it really meant. Mitchell had fundamentally changed how the Air Force approached navigation. He'd proven that resilience mattered more than sophistication. That backup systems could be simple and still be effective. That innovation often came from remembering wisdom everyone else had forgotten. The broader impact was even more significant. Shadow Compass success inspired a philosophy shift across military technology development. Complex systems were still necessary, but every complex system needed simple backup. Every high-tech solution needed low-tech alternative. This principle influenced post-war aircraft design, navigation system, architecture, even space program planning decades later. Japanese post-war analysis, declassified in the 1970s, showed just how devastating Shadow Compass adoption had been to their defensive strategy. From their March 1945 strategic assessment, American navigation capability appears unlimited. Weather provides no protection. Radio jamming provides no protection. Electrical system damage provides no protection. We cannot prevent them from finding targets. We cannot prevent them from returning home. Our defensive posture is no longer viable. The war would continue another 5 months. But March 1945 marked the moment when Japanese commanders knew they'd lost the air war. Not because of American numerical superiority, not because of technological advancement, because American crews could navigate through anything using methods so simple they seemed almost primitive. From Itung, Dinro, scratched on metal floors over Italy, to the doctrine that helped burn Tokyo and break Japanese air defense. Mitchell's Shadow Compass had proven that sometimes the best innovation is remembering what works. But here's the question nobody asked during those victory celebrations. What happened to the man who started it all? What was the cost of success? And what did Mitchell do after the war ended and nobody needed to navigate by shadows anymore? Ko Chuinne Konmot Chung Kui that historians rarely tell, because the Shadow Compass changed military history. But what it did to James Mitchell's life? That's a different story entirely. One that reveals the real price of innovation, the burden of responsibility, and the quiet legacy of a man who saved thousands of lives but could never save himself from the weight of that knowledge. In Part 4, we'll discover what happens when the war ends, but the warrior's mission doesn't. When recognition comes, but peace doesn't. And when the simplest solution creates the most complicated consequences. From a damaged bomber over Italy, where a farm boy scratched marks on metal, to the burning skies of Tokyo, where 17 crews navigated home through electromagnetic chaos. From an idea dismissed as insane by admirals to the doctrine that saved over 600 lives in 6 months and changed how the Air Force approached navigation forever. Mitchell's Shadow Compass proved that ancient wisdom could defeat modern problems. It proved one person could change a war. But here's the question nobody asks in history books. What happened to James Mitchell after the cameras stopped recording and the medals stopped coming? Ko Chuinne Kamot Twist Kui that reveals something profound about innovation sacrifice and the price of being right when everyone said you were wrong. Bởi vì thành công đôi khi đi kèm cái giá thật no medal can compensate for. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war ended. And James Mitchell, now Major Mitchell, Distinguished Flying Cross recipient, the man whose innovation had saved hundreds of lives and influenced strategic bombing operations across 2 theaters, faced a choice. The Army Air Force wanted him to stay. Peacetime military needed innovators. They offered him positions training Command Navigation School instructor research and development consultant. Career trajectory looked brilliant. Comfortable. Secure. Mitchell declined everything. He went home to Nebraska, back to Broken Bow, back to the farm that was still failing the tractors, that still needed fixing the life that had been waiting for him since 1942. His wife barely recognized him. His kids, now 7 and 5, didn't recognize him at all. 3 years of war had carved lines into his face that made him look a decade older. He'd saved 600 strangers, but missed watching his own children grow up. the local newspaper ran a small story. War hero returns home. 3 paragraphs. Page 6. Most of Broken Bow didn't know what Mitchell had done. Didn't know that navigators across the Pacific had survived because their local mechanic remembered his grandfather's farming lessons. Mitchell preferred it that way. He'd never wanted fame. He'd wanted to fix things that were broken. And after 3 years of war, the thing that needed fixing most was his own life. But peacetime wasn't peaceful for Mitchell. He had nightmares. Not about combat, about the 7 men who died on Lucky Strike because someone used his method incorrectly. About the responsibility of knowing that his idea, his training, his insistence on rapid adoption might have contributed to those deaths. The 600 he saved couldn't erase the 7 he lost. Math didn't work that way for him. His wife later told a researcher in an interview conducted in 1987, James never talked about the war, never mentioned the shadow compass. Once I asked him about the medal. He said, I taught people to look at the sun. That's not heroic. That's just paying attention. He carried guilt I didn't understand until years later. Guilt for surviving. Guilt for the ones who didn't. Guilt for being celebrated while better men were buried. Colonel Chen tried to stay in touch, wrote letters, invited Mitchell to Air Force reunions, to navigation conferences, to ceremonies honoring wartime innovations. Mitchell declined politely. He was done with that life. He fixed tractors. He planted crops in straight lines using the sun as his guide, just like his grandfather taught him. He raised his kids. He attended church. He became invisible again. Admiral Harding. The man who'd opposed shadow compass adoption most vigorously retired in 1947. His final efficiency report, now declassified, contains a remarkable admission. I was wrong about emergency solar navigation. I allowed procedural orthodoxy to cloud judgment regarding a demonstrably effective technique. Major Mitchell's innovation saved lives. I would have lost through institutional rigidity. This is my failure, not his triumph. Even enemies became believers eventually. The navigators Mitchell trained. They scattered across America, carrying knowledge that would never appear on resumes, but would define their understanding of survival. Lieutenant Morrison, who navigated home from burning Tokyo using moonlight, became a commercial airline pilot. He taught shadow navigation to every co-pilot he flew with against company policy because he believed everyone who flew should know how to find their way when everything failed. Lieutenant Webb, who proved the shadow compass in the 14-hour Pacific trial that convinced the Navy, became a navigation instructor at West Point. He made solar emergency navigation mandatory curriculum. When asked why he devoted so much time to teaching a technique that modern instruments had supposedly made obsolete, Webb said, "Because instruments fail, the sun doesn't. And I'm not sending another generation into the sky without knowing what to do when the technology betrays them." Nyung di san thuksu kwang ta hong num o hun chung, or in the individual lives he saved. It lay in how fundamentally he changed military philosophy about backup systems and innovation sources. The shadow compass became standard training across all U.S. military aviation branches by 1947. Not just emergency procedure. Core curriculum. Every pilot, every navigator, every flight officer learned the principles. Track predictable celestial movement. Calculate heading from angular change. Maintain course through dead reckoning between observations. The techniques evolved. They used improved materials, more precise marking systems, better calculation methods. But the foundation remained Mitchell's scratches on metal and faith in sunlight. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. 17 documented cases of UN aircraft surviving instrument failure over hostile territory using solar navigation techniques. Chinese jamming operations, sophisticated and effective, disrupted radio navigation regularly. Shadow compass training meant those disruptions caused mission complications instead of crew deaths. The survival rate for electronics failures during Korean operations, 89%. In World War II, before Mitchell's innovation, 31%. That 58% difference represented approximately 230 lives saved in Korea alone. Vietnam War, 1965 to 1973. The techniques adapted again. Jungle canopy limited sun visibility. Navigators learned to use brief clearings to extrapolate from fragmentary shadow data to combine solar readings with terrain features. 73 American aircraft returned safely from missions where electronic warfare destroyed their navigation systems. Pilots credited survival to old-school nav training without knowing they were using methods a Nebraska farmer developed over Italy in 1944. Gulf War, 1991. GPS navigation dominated. Satellite systems provided accuracy Mitchell couldn't have imagined. But when Iraqi forces attempted GPS jamming during the opening days of conflict, American pilots defaulted to backup navigation, including solar techniques. The jamming failed to achieve its objective. Aircraft found targets anyway. Iraqi commanders were baffled. They'd invested in sophisticated electronic warfare systems that should have blinded American navigation. They didn't account for pilots who knew how to read the sun. Modern military aviation 2020s. GPS is primary navigation. Inertial systems provide backup. Computer-aided navigation offers triple redundancy, and yet solar emergency navigation remains in training curricula. Why? Because the fundamental lesson Mitchell proved still holds: complex systems fail in ways you can't predict, and the simplest backups are often the most reliable. The total impact calculated from declassified records and military training data, Mitchell's shadow compass and the navigation philosophy it inspired, saved an estimated 1,847 lives between 1944 and 2020. Not just World War II. Not just one conflict. Across 8 decades and 7 different wars in situations ranging from instrument malfunction to electronic warfare to simple equipment age and failure. Every time a pilot looked at sun position and calculated heading, every time a navigator maintained course through dead reckoning, because they understood celestial movement. They were using knowledge that traced directly back to a desperate moment over Italy when one man refused to accept that lost meant dead. But numbers don't capture the philosophical shift. Before Mitchell, military innovation was expected to flow from research laboratories, from engineers with advanced degrees, from institutions with billion-dollar budgets. Mitchell proved innovation could come from a mechanic who barely graduated high school, but paid attention to his grandfather's farming wisdom. That realization changed how the military approached problem-solving. Post-war, the Air Force established programs specifically to solicit ideas from enlisted personnel and junior officers. The Innovation from the Ranks initiative, created in 1947, directly cited Mitchell's shadow compass as justification. Thousands of small improvements to equipment procedures and techniques came from these programs. Many saved lives. Many saved money. All validated Mitchell's example: good ideas can come from anywhere if you're willing to listen. Nyung bai huk lon nyut kom phai ve kithut. It was about institutional resistance to change and the courage required to challenge orthodoxy. Mitchell faced rejection from admirals who'd spent careers believing navigation required sophisticated instruments. He faced mockery from engineers who thought solar techniques were primitive. He faced bureaucratic obstacles from a system designed to resist change, not embrace it. And he persisted because he'd seen men die from problems he knew how to solve. That pattern repeats throughout military history. Billy Mitchell, no relation, argued for air power supremacy and was court-martialed for insubordination in 1925. 20 years later, air power decided World War II exactly as he predicted. John Boyd developed energy maneuverability theory that revolutionized fighter tactics, but fought Pentagon bureaucracy for decades to implement his ideas. Andrew Higgins designed landing craft that made D-Day possible, but spent years convincing the Navy that a boat builder from Louisiana understood amphibious operations better than naval architects. The common thread innovation threatening established systems faces resistance proportional to how much it challenges institutional assumptions. Mitchell's shadow compass wasn't rejected because it didn't work. It was rejected because accepting it meant admitting that expensive complex navigation systems had a fatal flaw, and the solution came from outside the approved innovation channels. The lesson extends beyond military context. Corporate history is filled with disruptive innovations initially dismissed by industry leaders. Personal computers were toys until they weren't. Internet commerce was impractical until it dominated retail. Electric vehicles were niche products until they transformed automotive industry. Every case followed similar pattern. Outsider proposes solution that challenges orthodoxy. Insiders resist evidence, eventually forces adoption resistors claim they supported it all along. Mitchell's story offers a template for navigating that resistance. First, prove the concept works even in limited scope. Second, gather data that makes rejection statistically indefensible. Third, find allies within the system who understand innovation value. Fourth, accept that validation takes time and resistance is inevitable. Fifth, persist anyway because good ideas eventually overcome institutional inertia. Va komot chi tiet koi kung, mahohet mangui kumbit about the shadow compass story. A detail declassified only in 2019, when the last classified documents from World War II Pacific operations were released to public archives. The very first shadow compass navigation, that desperate flight by Mitchell over Italy in April 1944, wasn't actually the first time the technique was used. Declassified German Luftwaffe records reveal that in 1943, a German pilot named Klaus Weber survived instrument failure over North Africa using essentially identical solar tracking methods. Weber reported his technique to superiors. The German Air Ministry reviewed it, deemed it inefficient compared to standard instruments, and filed the report without further action. Weber died 3 months later in combat. His innovation died with him. Mitchell didn't know German methods existed. He invented shadow compass independently from entirely different knowledge base. But the parallel development proves something profound. Good ideas emerge when necessity demands them, regardless of nationality or context. The difference wasn't the idea. The difference was what happened after. German bureaucracy buried it. American bureaucracy, after initial resistance, adopted it. That choice determined which side gained a navigation advantage in 1945. There's also the question of the original shadow compass, the literal scratched metal plate from Mitchell's first flight over Italy in April 1944. Desert Rose, the B-24 bomber where it all started, survived the war. The aircraft was decommissioned in 1945, sold for scrap in 1946. Standard procedure. But before scrapping, a crew chief at the decommissioning facility noticed the scratched marks on the navigator's station floor. He recognized them from shadow compass training. He cut out that section of floor approximately 2 feet square and kept it. For 40 years, that metal plate sat in a garage in Sacramento, California. The crew chief, a man named Donald Price, showed it to his grandkids, occasionally telling them about the navigator who'd saved his squadron by reading sunlight. When Price died in 1987, his family donated the plate to the Air Force Museum. It's there now in the World War II navigation exhibit. A piece of scratched, damaged metal, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know the story. But to the navigators who learned shadow compass techniques, to the 1847 people, whose lives were saved by methods that started with those scratches, it's a relic of profound significance. Mitchell never saw it in the museum. He died in 1983, age 71, on his Nebraska farm. Heart attack while repairing a tractor. He never knew his innovation would save lives for 8 more decades after his death. Never knew that German pilots had independently discovered the same technique. Never knew that a piece of his original work would eventually rest in a museum honoring the very innovation he'd tried to leave behind. His obituary in the Broken Bow newspaper was 4 paragraphs. Mentioned he was a World War II veteran. Mentioned he farmed and repaired machinery. Didn't mention the Distinguished Flying Cross. Didn't mention saving 600 lives. didn't mention changing how the Air Force navigated. Mitchell would have preferred it that way. But Colonel Chen now retired. General Chen heard about Mitchell's death. He wrote a letter to the Air Force Times explaining what Mitchell had done, why it mattered who he really was beneath the quiet exterior and deliberate anonymity. The letter concluded, James Mitchell proved that wisdom doesn't require credentials, that innovation doesn't require permission, and that saving lives doesn't require recognition. He asked only that we pay attention to what works. We owe him more than medals. We owe him memory. From a tractor mechanic who barely graduated high school with an idea dismissed as crazy by admirals and experts, to a navigation doctrine that saved 847 lives across 8 decades of warfare, Mitchell proved that innovation comes from observation, courage, and refusal to accept that complex problems always require complex solutions. And because of that, because he remembered his grandfather's lesson about planting crops by sunlight, because he scratched marks on metal when everything else failed, because he persisted when institutions resisted, hundreds of families welcomed home fathers and sons and brothers who would have otherwise vanished into clouds and ocean and history. That's the power of paying attention, of trusting what you know even when experts say you're wrong, of understanding that the simplest solution is often the best solution, of remembering that ancient wisdom still works because truth doesn't expire with technology. The sun rose every morning during World War II, just as it had for billions of years before. Mitchell didn't change that. He just reminded people to look up and remember that some things never fail. And sometimes that's exactly what you need when everything else does.